The story of Saddam Hussein's execution begins decades before the rope tightened around his neck. To understand the meaning of his downfall, you have to understand the empire he built. An empire of fear, of absolute power, of violence so deep that for many Iraqis, life itself became a performance of loyalty to one man. On July 16, 1979, Saddam Hussein rose to the presidency of Iraq, but his climb to power had begun long before. He was born in 1937 in the small village of Al-Ajah near Tikrit, raised in poverty, shaped by a violent childhood. His early years left him with scars, both physical and psychological, and a burning obsession with strength. To Saddam, weakness was death. When he joined the Ba'ath Party in his 20s, he quickly showed his talent for ruthlessness. He was no ordinary politician. He was ambitious, cunning, and willing to bloody his own hands. He played a crucial role in bringing the Baathists to power in 1968, and for the next decade, he tightened his grip from the shadows, eliminating rivals and building the security networks that would soon allow him to rule as a dictator. By 1979, when he officially replaced his mentor Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr as president, Saddam was ready to unveil the Iraq he envisioned, one man at the top, the nation revolving around him. Within days of taking office, he summoned hundreds of Ba'ath Party officials to a meeting. As the cameras rolled, he calmly announced that a plot had been uncovered against him. One by one, he read the names of supposed conspirators. Guards dragged them out as the others watched in terror. Those taken were executed. The message was unmistakable. Saddam was untouchable, and betrayal meant death. From that moment on, his presence became inescapable. His portraits hung in every classroom, office, and street. Billboards showed him smiling, waving, or dressed in military fatigues. His voice filled radios and televisions. Children were taught songs praising him. In Iraq, silence was not enough. You had to perform loyalty. To remain quiet was suspicious. To criticize him was suicidal. His security apparatus became one of the most feared in the world. The Mukhabarat, his intelligence service, planted spies in every neighborhood. People whispered in their own homes, afraid a family member might report them. Torture was routine. Prisoners described beatings, electric shocks, rape, acid baths. Entire families of dissidents could vanish overnight, erased without a trace. Saddam cultivated this fear deliberately. He wanted every Iraqi to believe he was everywhere. And yet, he was not merely a tyrant hiding in bunkers. He was a man who embraced the spotlight. He gave speeches in military uniform, posed on horseback, fired rifles into the air. He built palaces filled with marble and gold while ordinary Iraqis struggled with shortages. He compared himself to Nebuchadnezzar, the ancient king of Babylon, and even had coins minted with his image beside ancient rulers, as if he were part of history itself. But Saddam's rule was not only built on propaganda and torture, it was also defined by war. In 1980, just a year after seizing the presidency, Saddam launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. The Iran-Iraq War would drag on for 8 brutal years, leaving perhaps 1 million people dead. Saddam used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and even against his own Kurdish citizens in Halabja, where mustard gas and nerve agents suffocated thousands of men, women, and children. The images of twisted bodies and lifeless children became symbols of his cruelty. Despite the horrors, Saddam portrayed the war as proof of his strength. Iraq survived against Iran, a larger nation with more manpower. He declared victory even though the war ended in a stalemate. But the cost was immense: billions of dollars spent, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and an economy broken. Not long after, in 1990, Saddam made another gamble. He invaded Kuwait, claiming it as Iraq's 19th province. The world responded with fury. A U.S.-led coalition drove his forces out in the Gulf War of 1991. American bombs obliterated Iraqi infrastructure. Bridges, power plants, and water systems were left in ruins. And yet, Saddam survived again. Though his military collapsed, though uprisings in southern Shia cities and in the Kurdish north nearly toppled him. He crushed them with tanks and helicopters. Mass graves would later reveal the scale of his revenge, tens of thousands slaughtered. The 1990s became a decade of isolation and punishment. United Nations sanctions strangled Iraq's economy. Ordinary citizens starved and lacked medicine. But Saddam and his elite thrived. While children died from preventable diseases, Saddam built more palaces. While families ate scraps, he imported fine whiskey and luxury goods. And still, he projected strength. Every broadcast showed him shaking his fist, defying America, promising Iraqis that he was the only one who could protect them. Fear kept him in power. His sons, Uday and Qusay, became symbols of his brutality, notorious for sadistic violence. His half-brother Barzan Ibrahim al-Takriti oversaw ruthless intelligence operations. Together, they created a climate where resistance was unimaginable. By the dawn of the 21st century, Saddam Hussein had ruled Iraq for nearly 24 years. He had survived war with Iran, war with the United States, international sanctions, and uprisings from his own people. His face still loomed over Baghdad. His spies still lurked in every corner. To many Iraqis, the idea that he could ever be overthrown was unthinkable. And yet, just beyond the horizon, the forces that would end his reign were gathering. The United States accused him of harboring weapons of mass destruction. President George W. Bush named him part of the axis of evil. Plans were drawn, troops were prepared. Saddam had ruled with fear for decades. But soon, the man who once seemed eternal would be dragged into the light. His fall was coming. The 2003 invasion and the hunt for Saddam. For almost a quarter of a century, Saddam Hussein seemed unshakable. He had survived wars with neighbors, uprisings within his borders, and the crushing weight of international sanctions. His grip on Iraq was so total that many ordinary people believed he would die of old age in one of his many palaces, untouchable until the end. But in 2003, the storm that finally swept him away broke with overwhelming force. The build up to war. After the September 11, 2001 attacks in the United States, the global order shifted. The American government turned its full attention to enemies it believed supported terrorism or posed hidden dangers. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was suddenly at the center of Washington's crosshairs. The Bush administration accused Saddam of developing weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and possibly nuclear arms. They also claimed he harbored links to terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda. The intelligence was shaky, later proven false or exaggerated, but at the time, it created a sense of imminent threat. To American leaders, Saddam wasn't just a brutal dictator, he was a danger to global security. Diplomatic pressure mounted. Inspections were carried out by the United Nations. Iraq denied the charges, but suspicions remained. By early 2003, the United States and its allies were ready for war. Shock and awe. On March 20, 2003, the sky over Baghdad erupted. The American military launched what it called shock and awe. Cruise missiles screamed through the night, striking military targets, government buildings, and infrastructure. The skies lit with orange fireballs. The ground shook as explosions rolled through the capital. For ordinary Iraqis, the invasion came not as a slow march but as a thunderclap. American and coalition forces swept in with overwhelming speed. In the south, British troops took Basra. In the west, U.S. Marines drove across the desert. And in the center, the main thrust of American armor surged toward Baghdad. Iraqi soldiers fought in places, but the resistance crumbled quickly. Saddam's army, once feared as one of the strongest in the region, melted away under relentless airstrikes and armored assaults. The Republican Guard, his elite units, tried to hold key bridges and cities, but their weapons and morale were no match for the modern American war machine. By early April, the road to Baghdad was open. The fall of Baghdad. On April 9, 2003, American tanks rolled into the Iraqi capital. The streets were a mix of chaos and silence. Some Iraqis hid indoors, terrified of what would come. Others spilled into the streets, curious, dazed, or emboldened. That afternoon, in Firdos Square, the most symbolic image of the war unfolded. A massive statue of Saddam Hussein, towering over the city, was pulled down with the help of U.S. troops. Crowds stomped on the fallen figure, slapping it with their shoes, a deep insult in Arab culture. The dictator's face, once impossible to escape, lay shattered on the ground. Television cameras beamed the moment across the world. To many, it seemed like the end of Saddam's rule. His palaces were looted, his ministries deserted, his security forces vanished. But the man himself, the one face that mattered most, was gone, vanishing into the shadows. In the chaos of Baghdad's fall, Saddam Hussein disappeared. He had slipped out of the capital, moving between safe houses, protected by loyalists, shielded by family networks around his hometown of Tikrit. For months no one knew where he was. The U.S. military launched one of the largest manhunts in modern history. The operation to find him was codenamed Operation Red Dawn, named after the 1984 American movie about a guerrilla war against invaders. But this was no fiction. Thousands of soldiers, intelligence operatives, and special forces were tasked with hunting one man. Every whisper was pursued. If someone claimed Saddam had been spotted in a village, troops arrived within hours. Suspected safe houses were raided. His former bodyguards and aides were rounded up, interrogated, and pressed for information. To symbolize the hunt, the Americans created the infamous deck of cards. A set of playing cards with the faces of Iraq's most wanted regime figures. Generals, ministers, intelligence chiefs, all assigned ranks. Saddam Hussein was the ace of spades, the card every soldier wanted to hold. Closing in, as the months passed, the noose tightened. His sons, Uday and Qusay Hussein, were cornered and killed in a fierce gun battle with American forces in July 2003. Their deaths were a major blow, not just militarily but psychologically. Saddam's dynasty was crumbling. Still, the man himself remained elusive. He grew thinner. His beard grew long and scraggly. He moved from farmhouse to farmhouse, sleeping underground, relying on a shrinking circle of loyalists. The Americans studied his past, his habits, his psychology. They knew he might try to hide near his birthplace, Tikrit, and they were right. The Spider Hole. On the night of December 13, 2003, soldiers from the U.S. 4th Infantry Division and Special Forces closed in on a small farmhouse in the village of Ad-Dar, near Tikrit. The area was quiet, surrounded by date palms and farmland. During the search, they spotted a patch of dirt covered with bricks and debris. Clearing it away, they uncovered a narrow hole, a crude underground hideout barely big enough for one man to lie in. A spider hole. Inside, they found Saddam Hussein. The once mighty dictator looked nothing like the figure who had ruled Iraq with fear. His hair was messy and graying, his beard unkempt. His clothes were worn and dirty. A pistol lay beside him, but he didn't use it. He made no attempt to fight. Instead, blinking against the light after months in the dark, he surrendered. One soldier later recalled his words. "I am Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, and I want to negotiate." But there was no negotiation. He was pulled out of the hole, searched, and taken into custody. The hunt was over. The world reacts. When news of his capture spread, it sent shockwaves through Iraq and the wider world. For many Iraqis, it was a moment they thought they would never see. Crowds danced in the streets. Shia neighborhoods erupted in celebration. Some carried pictures of relatives killed under Saddam's regime, shouting that justice had finally come. But in Sunni areas, the reaction was more subdued, even bitter. For Saddam's loyalists, his capture was a humiliation. Some refused to believe it, insisting it was propaganda. For the United States, it was a triumph. President George W. Bush went on television and declared, "The capture of this man was crucial to the rise of a free Iraq." American officials hoped the arrest would mark a turning point, weakening the insurgency that was beginning to grow. But if they expected peace, they were mistaken. Saddam was gone, but the violence was only just beginning. A dictator unmasked, The image of Saddam being pulled from the spider hole became iconic. For decades, he had cultivated an image of strength, rifles raised, statues towering, portraits painted to show him as a modern-day Babylonian king. But now the world saw him reduced to a tired old man dragged from the dirt, blinking in the light, powerless. For many Iraqis, it was surreal. The man who once seemed like a permanent shadow over their lives had been unmasked as mortal, vulnerable, even pitiful. And yet, his capture did not erase the scars he had left. Mass graves still held the bones of his victims. Families still waited for answers about missing loved ones. Entire communities still bore the trauma of his reign. Saddam Hussein was no longer free, but his story was far from over. His fate would now be decided not on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. The trial. When American soldiers dragged Saddam Hussein out of the spider hole in December 2003, the world gasped. The man who had ruled Iraq with terror for nearly 24 years had been reduced to a disheveled prisoner. But his capture was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one of the most dramatic trials in modern history. A dictator who had ordered mass killings, who had waged wars and silenced millions with fear, would now stand before judges. This was not a military tribunal in some secret base. This was Baghdad itself, in the heart of a fractured, blood-soaked Iraq, and the trial would be seen by the world, from palace to prisoner. After his capture, Saddam was placed under strict U.S. guard. For more than 2 years, he was kept in secret facilities, moved constantly so his supporters could not attempt a rescue. At times, he was held at Camp Cropper, a heavily fortified prison near Baghdad International Airport. At other times, he was shifted to undisclosed safe houses. Gone were the palaces, the marble floors, the gold-plated bathrooms. Gone were the loyal guards who had once followed his every order. Saddam lived in a cell with bare walls and a simple cot. Soldiers described him as spending hours in solitude, sometimes scribbling notes, sometimes staring silently into space. When interrogated, he was often defiant. He insisted he was still the rightful president of Iraq, not a criminal. He asked about his sons, about his inner circle, and about the country that had slipped from his grasp. But he was no longer giving orders. He was waiting, preparing the trial. The Americans faced a decision what to do with Saddam Hussein. Executing him without trial risked turning him into a martyr for his loyalists. Keeping him indefinitely would inflame sectarian anger. They decided to put him on trial in an Iraqi court, giving the new government a chance to show justice in action. The tribunal, called the Iraqi High Tribunal, was established in 2003. It was designed to prosecute crimes committed by Saddam's regime. But the scale of Saddam's crimes was staggering. Decades of rule had left a trail of mass killings, wars, and brutal crackdowns. Which case should they choose first? They settled on the Dujail massacre of 1982. The story of Dujail. On a scorching July day in 1982, Saddam Hussein's motorcade drove through the small farming town of Dujail, about 50 miles north of Baghdad. Dujail was home to a large Shia Muslim population, a community Saddam's Sunni-led regime often distrusted. Iraq was in the middle of the devastating war with Iran, and Saddam suspected many Shia Iraqis of harboring loyalty to Tehran. That day, as his convoy passed through the town, shots rang out. Members of a Shia underground resistance group opened fire on Saddam's car. None of the bullets hit him. He wasn't even scratched. But to Saddam, this was not just an assassination attempt. It was a personal insult, a direct challenge to his absolute authority. His revenge was swift, brutal, and merciless. Within hours, Saddam's security forces descended on Dujail. Soldiers raided homes, dragging men, women, and children into the streets. Families were torn apart. Mothers wept as their sons were taken. Fathers were beaten in front of their children. Dozens of residents were thrown into prison, where they endured horrific interrogations. Survivors later testified to beatings, electric shocks, and starvation. Months later, quick trials were staged. There were no lawyers, no real defense, no fair process. Verdicts were predetermined. 148 men and boys, some as young as teenagers, were condemned to death. They were executed and buried in unmarked graves. But the punishment went beyond executions. Saddam ordered the destruction of Dujail's orchards and farmland. For a farming town, this was economic annihilation. Families lost their livelihood, their food, their future. What had begun as a 30-second burst of gunfire turned into years of suffering for an entire community. For the tribunal, Dujail was the perfect case: large numbers of victims, living survivors to testify, clear documentation from the regime's own archives, and undeniable evidence of Saddam's direct involvement. The courtroom. On October 19, 2005, Saddam Hussein was brought to court. The world watched. Television cameras broadcast the proceedings live, though sometimes with delays or censorship. The trial was held in Baghdad, inside a heavily guarded compound ringed with concrete walls, barbed wire, and armed soldiers. The courtroom itself was modest but tense. Judges sat high above the floor. Witnesses were protected by screens or voice distortions, fearing retribution. Defense lawyers walked in and out under the constant shadow of death threats. Some would later be assassinated. When Saddam entered for the first time, the room shifted. He was thinner than before, with a gray beard and tired eyes, but he carried himself with the same arrogance that had defined his rule. He refused to acknowledge the court's authority. He shouted at the judges, called them illegitimate, and insisted he was still the president of Iraq. At times, he mocked the process. At others, he shouted passionately, as if he were still addressing the nation. His defiance rattled the courtroom. For years, Iraqis had seen this man only as a figure of absolute power. Now they saw him shouting at guards, dragged to his seat, arguing with judges who no longer feared him. Testimonies of suffering. The most powerful moments came when survivors of Dujail testified. Old men spoke of being dragged from their homes. Women described the night soldiers stormed through their doors. Families recounted how their sons vanished into prisons and never returned. One witness recalled orchards being bulldozed, the sound of trees cracking and falling while families screamed. Another described the torture chambers where prisoners were electrocuted, beaten, and left half dead. These stories painted a picture of collective punishment on an unimaginable scale. It was not just the men who fired on Saddam's convoy who paid the price. It was an entire town. Violence outside the court. The trial itself was as dangerous as the crimes it examined. Judges received constant death threats. Defense lawyers were assassinated in the streets. Bombs went off in Baghdad almost daily. Some argued the trial should be moved outside Iraq to a safer international court, but the new Iraqi government insisted it must happen on Iraqi soil as a symbol of national justice. The atmosphere was so tense that even the judges rotated for their own safety. The chief judge, at the start, Rizqar Amin, eventually resigned after facing political pressure and threats. He was replaced by Rauf Abdul Rahman, a Kurdish judge known for his toughness. Saddam's strategy. Throughout the trial, Saddam tried to turn the process into a stage. He shouted nationalist slogans. He accused the Americans of orchestrating the whole thing. He claimed the judges were traitors. At times, he refused to appear. At other times, he walked in smiling, waving, as if still a leader commanding respect. But beneath the theatrics, the evidence kept stacking. Documents signed by his regime, orders linking him directly to the executions, eyewitnesses who had survived torture, photographs and records that could not be denied. The verdict. On November 5, 2006, the verdict was announced. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the words. Saddam Hussein was guilty of crimes against humanity for the killings, torture, and forced displacement of the people of Dujail. His sentence: death by hanging. Two of his closest men also faced the rope. Barzan Ibrahim al-Tikriti, Saddam's half-brother and feared intelligence chief, and Awad Hamid al-Bandar, the judge who had signed the death orders for Dujail. Both were condemned alongside him. The announcement rippled across Iraq. In Shia neighborhoods, crowds poured into the streets, firing guns in celebration, waving flags, cheering. Families of victims wept and prayed, finally feeling some justice after decades of fear. But in sunny areas, the mood was dark. Protests broke out. People carried Saddam's pictures, shouting that the trial was rigged, that it was a show trial staged by Americans and their allies. For them, Saddam was not just a dictator. He was also a symbol of Sunni dominance, and his execution felt like an attack on their identity. A nation divided. By late 2006, Iraq was already drowning in sectarian violence. Car bombings, assassinations, and militia killings ripped through the country daily. The trial's verdict did not bring closure. It poured gasoline on an already raging fire. To Shia Iraqis, the sentence was righteous justice. To many Sunnis, it was a political execution dressed up as law. To the Americans, it was a chance to show progress in rebuilding Iraq's justice system. To the wider world, it was a reminder of how fragile the new Iraq had become. And for Saddam himself, the verdict did not break him. He remained defiant, shouting to the end that the court was illegitimate, that history would judge him differently. He showed no remorse, no apology. But the machinery of justice was moving, and his final days were numbered. The countdown. Under Iraqi law, once a final appeal was denied, an execution had to be carried out within 30 days. There was no long delay, no endless appeals. Saddam's lawyers tried one last time to save him, but on December 26, 2006, the appeal was officially rejected. From that moment, Saddam had just 4 days left to live. The man who once seemed untouchable, who had built a kingdom of fear and blood, now faced the same fate he had given to so many others. He had overseen thousands of hangings, countless executions in prison yards. Now he would stand on the same trapdoor, the execution on live TV and its aftermath. By the final week of December 2006, Saddam Hussein's fate was sealed. The Iraqi High Tribunal had sentenced him to death by hanging for crimes against humanity in the Dujail massacre. His appeal had been rejected. The countdown was over. For years he had lived like a god-king. His face on every wall, his name on every tongue, his orders feared more than death itself. Now, he was just another condemned man in a prison cell, waiting for the hour when the rope would take him. And yet, even in those final days, the shadow of Saddam Hussein loomed over Iraq. His execution would not simply end a life. It would split the country, ignite debate across the world, and produce one of the most chilling pieces of leaked video footage of the modern era. The last days. Saddam was transferred to Camp Justice in Baghdad, a name that dripped with irony.